I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss the theme of the polis and the family. And the word polis comes to us from classical Greek, our word politics, policy. These words are related to the Greek word polis. And the theme, the polis and the family, it's obviously a very big theme. I want to say just a few things. And I'll begin with a comment on this very clever Frenchman called Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to the United States in the early 1800s. And he was studying American society. What are these Americans like? What is their society like? And he looked at many aspects of American society and culture. And one of the things he studied was the family. And de Tocqueville often compared and contrasted what he knew from the old world, I think, thinking substantially of France, which is where he was from, and he would compare that and contrast that with what he saw in the New World here in the United States. And Tocqueville thought about the relationship between father and son. And one of his observations is that in the old world, among aristocratic peoples, he says, fathers are associated with command in the family, and they are the sustainers of a family, speaking economically. And there certainly may be affection between father and son in the family, but the father's position is one, Tocqueville says, of magistrate, that is, of judge within the family. Tocqueville notices that in democracies, and here he's thinking, I think, of the United States, that there's greater equality among father and son. And this obviously is especially true as the son grows older. And in time, father and son are political equals. They are citizens with equal political power. One man, one vote. And Tocqueville notices, or at least he claims to see, that in American families there's a greater degree of tenderness between father and son, and he hypothesizes that this has to do with the fact that there's greater equality between them. Clearly, a father has power over a child, has influence over a child, but as the child grows, the relationship equalizes in a democracy, and the relationship is touched by a greater degree of tenderness than what we might see in the old world. And the question is, how did this come to pass? What is something that helped to make this possible? If what de Tocqueville observed was correct, what helped to make it possible? Let's look at three cases of thinking about the family. And one place we can turn to is Plato's Republic. And in this book, Plato describes what, in his view, would be an ideal society, the best sort of society. And he divides the society into three basic classes of people. So you have producers, and these would be craftspeople. These would be woodworkers. These would be merchants. Then you have the auxiliaries, and these would be your law enforcement people and your defense people, the warriors. And then you have the guardians, and these are the rulers and the governors, and from them will be selected the philosopher king, that is, the ruler of the society. Now, when Plato comments on the family, most of his comments on the family come from his discussion of the guardians, how guardians should be made, so to speak, how guardians should be raised, what their subculture should be like. One of the things that Plato advocates is the elimination of any sense of individuality, that individual identity should be subsumed under communal identity. So communal identity, the identity of the community, rules. Consequently, Plato calls for the absence of private property, the elimination of private property among the guardians. And in relation to this theme, Plato then also calls for the elimination or the absence of exclusive intimate physical relationships between men and women. So, for example, he says all these women among the guardians are to belong to all of these men. No woman is to live privately with any man. And so we can think about the family as being primarily about producing guardians, not producing affection among individuals. Um, Plato also calls for the absence of a particular parent-child relationship. And so he says that the children in this ideal society should be held in common. No parent should know who his or her particular children are. And Plato called for the creation of a breeding program, basically, where the best men and the best women would get together, and the offspring of those unions would be taken care of, but then the offspring of inferior peoples might be discarded. Now, we have actually seen programs like this. One was tried in Nazi Germany, the Lebensborn program, where the best specimens of Nazi boys and Nazi girls are brought together with the ideal of producing ideal Nazi babies. This idea has been tried, and obviously it's horrific. And then you have something like this described in this powerful children's novel called The Giver. Well, in any event, it seems that in Plato's Republic, the family has no meaning separate from that of the polis. The interests of the polis rule. And so to get back to the question, well, where did this sense of tenderness that de Tocqueville detected in the American family, where did it come from? What are its roots? I think we can clearly say it doesn't have anything to do with Plato's Republic. In his Politics, Aristotle, differently from his teacher Plato, sees the importance of distinct families. Obviously, families are important for reproduction and the raising of children, and Aristotle recognizes that most of the time people will have greater affection for their own children than they will for the children of strangers, and he sees nothing wrong with that. And then Aristotle sees the importance, the family's importance in the fact that people come together to collaborate. They bring their labor together, and they're able to accomplish more and make life better. So in a home, a father may have certain jobs, a wife has certain jobs, children have certain jobs, and they work together, and they make an efficient system. And so families are the most basic collaborative unit in a society, and then families join other families that have other things to bring to the polis, and these families join together and create a polis, and you have people who do different sorts of jobs and so on. And so for Aristotle, the family is a basic unit of society, and Aristotle is open to the idea that children and parents can have feelings of friendship for one another. Aristotle says that a parent seems by nature to feel a kind of friendship for offspring and offspring for parents and so on. So he disagrees with Plato that it's possible for all children to be held in common, for these special attachments not to be formed. And then Aristotle is also open to the idea that a kind of friendship can exist between husband and wife. And so Aristotle's open to this idea, and therefore, for Aristotle, the family has some meaning apart from the polis, the meaning that the people within a family have within that family, the feelings they have for one another, the affection they have for one another, the work they do for one another. All of this has meaning, and then these families form the basic units of a polis. And so Aristotle points out that affection within the family is natural, but at the same time Aristotle sees that there are great differences and great distances between fathers and children, between men and women, husbands and wives. And so while he's open to the idea of friendship, for example, between husband and wife, he mentions it and says very little about it, whereas he goes on at much greater length on the theme of friendship between men. And then the idea of friendship between the human and the divine for Aristotle is an idea that's completely foreign, because the distance between people and the divine, the distance between people and the gods, is so great. So if we go back to the question, what are the roots of this sense of tenderness that might exist in democratic families, or families in democratic societies, as de Tocqueville saw, then we can see something in Aristotle. He certainly is open to the idea of friendship and tenderness within a family. The last case we'll look at comes to us from the early Christians. And Plato thought of the polis as one state, and Aristotle thought of the polis as, one state. The early Christians had the idea that they were citizens of two states. They had the idea of being dual citizens, so to speak. And in an early Christian writing, this is not in the New Testament, but it's a very early Christian writing called the Epistle to Diognetus. The writer sort of describes the early Christians' outlook on the world. So on the one hand, they are residents in their place here in this world, but at the same time, they're transients. They feel like their real home is somewhere else. They're citizens here in this world, but at the same time, they are aliens because their true citizenship is in another kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. Their days are passed on the earth, the writer says, but their citizenship is above in the heavens. Now, among these people who had this sense of dual citizenship, that there was one polis here in the world and they had obligations to that, and then there's another polis in another world and they have an obligation to that, they also had a different outlook on the possibilities within the family. And so, for example, when St. Paul writes to a church at Ephesus in present-day Turkey, he tells wives to be subject, that is, obedient to their own husbands. Well, everybody at that time will understand that completely. This idea is taken for granted. Wives will obey their husbands. That idea is taken for granted. What's quite unusual is that Paul then goes on to say that husbands also have an obligation to their wives. And so Paul says to husbands, love your wives. And then he gives a theological reason, just as Christ loved the church. So that first bit, wives obey your husbands, be subject to your husbands, that's normal. Everybody in this world at that time understands this. But the other idea, husbands, you too have an obligation to your wives to love them. That is an idea that would be much less common in the first century and the second century. When Paul writes that a wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband, well, everyone will understand that idea, because that would be a very common idea when it was expressed. But then Paul goes on to say something quite unusual. He says, in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to the wife. Once again, there's this idea of mutual obligation. The power doesn't all reside with the husband. The husband has obligations to the wife as well. Not only an obligation to provide economically, but an obligation to provide emotionally and physically. When St. Paul writes in his letter to the Ephesians that children should obey their parents, well, of course, everybody at the time will say, well, of course, that's obvious. But then Paul goes on to say, but fathers, don't exasperate your children. And so, once again, within the family, we can see that these early Christians have an ideal that within a family, yes, there is a power structure, so to speak, but there is significant room for affection and tenderness, mutual regard, and mutual obligation. And then Paul writes in a different letter of his that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female. All are one in Christ Jesus. Now, of course, in this world, in this earthly polis, there are differences of status. There are differences in wealth. There are differences in position. But in the other polis, in the heavenly kingdom, according to the early Christian ideal, there's a different standard. And in that kingdom, we're all equal. And I think what that helps to make possible then is a greater sense of tenderness and mutual regard within the family. I'm the father, I do have authority, but my son is my equal in Christ. This is the early Christian ideal. And so we can see that these ideals within the family reflect other ideals that Christians have. So, for example, Paul writes in his letter to Christians at Rome, he says that the Spirit you received brought about your adoption. That is, you were living in this world, but now you've been adopted by a Father in a different world. And by Him, that is, by the Spirit, we cry, Abba, Father. And that word Abba there has very affectionate, has connotations of affection. It's like saying daddy. And so while clearly early Christian writings talk about a God to be feared, a God to be revered, even a God of anger at times, there's also this element of affection, God as daddy. And then we have Jesus quoted in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says to his disciples, I no longer call you servants, instead I call you friends. Again, there's this language of affection. And so we come back to where we began, that Tocqueville notices that here in the United States in the early 1800s, he notices it's a very religious society, that people read the Bible, that they go to church. And he notices that in the family there's a greater sense of equality, which is associated with the democratic system that exists in the country, but there's also a greater sense of tenderness. And we asked, what might be the historical roots of that? And I think if we look at early Christian writings, we can see some of those roots. Now, clearly it's going to take a long time for those ideals to work themselves out, and they're never worked out perfectly, where, across the board, husbands are working to love their wives, to be affectionate. That's never going to happen in every home. But some societies do better than others, and de Tocqueville noticed this degree of tenderness. Here he's speaking between father and son, but, this comes in the context of his discussion of the family in general. And I think we see in Aristotle a move in that direction, the idea of tenderness, of affection within a family. And then I think certainly among the early Christians, we see definite strong steps in that direction. Okay, well, I'll end this presentation here. And I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.